All right, section 4, closing, the closing date. This is a section where we are establishing when we intend to close by. Not that deals ever get pushed or closings never happens. No, it will happen. Just get ready for it. But let's address this. When does closing, how do we deal with this section 4? It's small but important.
Right. So we can read it. The closing of this transaction. And one thing you'll notice as you're reading these, line 50 has no what I call capitalized terms. Line 51, capitalized terms. So closing agent having a capitalized terms has a definition somewhere in the contract.
Gotcha.
So collected also has a definition which you can find in standard S. So the closing of the transaction shall occur when all funds required for closing are received by the closing agent. So typically I'm the closing agent. You should be able to pick up a phone, call me and say, have you received all the funds? Traditionally, lender funds we're going to get by a wire. If we've received a wire, we can immediately send the wire out, let's say to the seller. That's why traditionally the law states a buyer cannot bring in a personal check because a personal check is not immediately cleared.
Right.
So as far as closing agent receiving all of the funds, that's usually a yes or no question. We do have people who have initiated a wire. That doesn't mean we've received it. That means they have notified their bank, can you please send a wire? And some banks say, when you initiate or when you tell us about it, we have 24 hours to actually click the buttons and send it. So be aware of that.
So understand something. This means that until he has it in his hand, he can't turn around and give it to the seller.
Correct.
Okay? And he's not going to say, yeah, well, let's just pull it out of my own business account. So it's when he's received it, when the closing company or agent has received it and can transfer it, that's got to happen for a closing to occur.
Right. And where this comes into play, simultaneous closings, where you have a buyer who's selling one and then buying another. And they're like, listen, we're closing with you as a seller at 8 o'clock and we're buying at 1 o'clock. I need you to make sure you can fund me. And I say, well, some of that's out of my control.
Yeah.
And part of what's out of my control is in line 51, where they use right after standard S, the word and. So it's a two-part. The and is all closing documents required to be furnished by each party pursuant to the contract are delivered to the closing. So if it's a cash deal, I'm, as a closing agent, pretty much in control of saying when I have received. And sometimes we can receive buyer's documents just by scan and email, especially on a cash deal. On a closing that involves a lender, we as a closing company must follow lender's instructions. And most of the lender's instructions are going to say, you are not allowed to disperse money to the parties until I'm in receipt of the original closing documents. And that's usually where we run into sellers get upset because we have closing December 31st, but I can't fund them until the next business day because the buyer was a mail out. I won't get their documents. The closing instructions from the lender say, Mark, you are not allowed to give out money until you're in receipt of the original. So if you're representing a seller, good time to explain to them the process because they may not do closings all the time and they may not understand closing date per the contract does not necessarily mean funding date for the seller or for the seller's payoff.
There we go. And a lot of times, folks, this goes smoothly and a lot of times it doesn't. So, there are moments where it gets pushed and it's just a matter of movement of these things. Or we don't have, maybe the closing company, some of them just, not the closing company, but the lenders sometimes wait until the last minute and they're scrambling to get one more piece of information verification so that they can release those funds. Here's the most important thing I would say, or one of the important things to say, is before you write onto this contract the anticipated closing date, you need to get on the phone with the lender because it's kind of the golden rule. The person with the gold makes the rules.
Right.
And you say, we want to have a closing on this date. Realistically, can you do this? Okay? And make sure that they have a confident level that they can do that within the time frame. And you'll learn in time which lenders just will kind of buy your business saying, yeah, I can do that. And they're always pushing, and others that you can just take it to the bank. Right.
And usually what I find is if you find about 2 or 3 local lenders that
Mhm.
you can pick up a phone call or drive to their office, they're much more responsive than the buyer who comes running to you that just says, I just found the perfect internet lender. My rate's going to be 0. And they say they can close it tomorrow. So when you see that, you just kind of shake your head and say, okay, you send them an email saying, okay, your lender is an online lender, whatever. Please make sure they abide by the closing dates in the contract. I don't really have any control over them.
Yeah.
And that's what you'll notice in lines 52 or 53 and 54. This is where, and you can put here on or before.
Yeah.
And let me tell you what that will mean. If we see a contract, and understand that closing companies can interpret these differently. So what I'm telling you is my preference or how we handle it. If you elect to go somewhere else, they may say, Mark has no idea what he's talking about. That's not how we do it here. So be aware. But for me, if you put on or before December 31st, what that means is the parties have sort of agreed that this may close sooner.
Yes.
But let's say you want to close, this says December 31st. Everybody, the buyer, I can do it by December 20th. We will call the seller and say, can you also do it on the 20th? We need both sides to agree that they can do it. Because the seller may say, well, wait a second. I got a moving truck. I got people coming over. I got to make sure they're all available. I'm not sure if I can do it on the 20th. So just because it says on or before, it's not a unilateral right of
Yeah.
one party or the other to automatically move closing date up.
And you need to have that conversation because the other party can say, no, we're going by the letter of the contract. And it says on or before, we're going to push it out to the 31st.
Yeah, and we've had that happen.
Yeah, it happens. But this is where, keep in mind, the agent that you're working with are co-brokers, cooperating brokers. This is why you want to play well in the sandbox with the other kids on the playground. You want to have a good relationship and cooperate and say, hey, look, this is what we're thinking. We don't want a bunch of pushes, but our intention is to close in 30 days, but we don't want to find ourselves outside of that. Can we agree to give a window of 45 days with the expectation that we'll do it in 30? Sometimes that works really well. Sometimes it can feel funky to the other side, but cooperate. You're in partnership there to get the deal done so that the seller wins, the buyer wins, and everybody's happy.
Yeah, and one thing you'll learn, the closer it is to contract signing, the more all the parties are willing to work with each other. As the days and months go on, it's kind of like having family in town. Everybody gets a little edgy and bitchy and maybe not willing to sign extensions or play well in the sandbox. So the sooner you can spot something like that, and the parties seem to be, seller wants to sell, buyer wants to buy.
All right, so that's section 4. Next section is all about the extension of a closing date because that can happen. And we're going to talk about that. You need to know. Come back, watch number 5.